Low grade, substandard, down market, low music hall drivel. BBC News.
Sir Walter Scott arguably invented the idea of Scottishness and marketed it to the world, but now he's virtually unread and stands accused of saddling Scotland with tartan tat and Highland kitsch. In half an hour in Great Lives, the Tory MP, author and adventurer Rory Stewart will champion the life of this historical novelist, playwright and poet. Before that, it's time for Word of Mouth, presented by Chris Ledgard.
Often on Word of Mouth, we talk about how quickly language is changing. Looking at technology, social media, globalisation, we can chart the way our day-to-day language is being buffeted and shifted by the modern world. But what about the language of religion? The words used in religious ritual often have ancient roots, and even in modernised versions they sound a long way from street talk. But preachers delivering their own words have greater freedom. And in this programme, we'll talk about some of the ways they use it. Let's start outside a mosque in Leicester.
My name is Ibrahim Mogra, Sheikh Ibrahim Mogra. I'm the Assistant Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain. We're now in a part of Leicester which is very highly populated by Muslim families. This is a row of terraced houses, and as you can see, the mosque at the far end there was several houses, perhaps 3 or 4 houses that were purchased by the community with internal walls knocked down and then converted into a full-fledged mosque.
And this is what you would call a house mosque?
Yeah, many would describe it as a house mosque.
Well, let's go and have a look and a listen, if we may, and also talk a bit more to you about preaching.
Sure thing, yes. The prayer that we're going to observe now is what we call one of the silent prayers, where the scriptures are recited but they're not recited audibly. So we're going in here this way.
Thank you.
So you can see the low ceiling clearly demonstrating the fact that this used to be a row of houses.
Have you preached here?
I have preached here, yes.
What language do you preach in?
A lot of my preaching is done in English. In the mosque it's largely English, Arabic, Urdu. As you can see, the gentleman behind us now getting ready for the call to prayer, which he's going to call out now.
What are the words?
God is the greatest. There is none worthy of worship except God. Muhammad is God's messenger. Come to prayer. Come to success. So that was the call to prayer, which is done 5 times a day. Not always on the loudspeakers.
There's a microphone pointing out of a wall here with a notice next to it saying, please do not use the mic for azan after 8 p.m.
That's right, not after 8 p.m. because our neighbours would be sleeping.
People might be able to pick up in the background quite a stream of people coming in behind us, taking off their shoes and putting them in the cubby holes.
We see all the men coming in. Sadly, this mosque does not have facilities where women can be accommodated. There are other mosques.
Would women pray separately?
We would pray in 2 separate groups but pray together. So it'd be the same prayer behind the same imam, but just in 2 segregated groups. And it follows from also the laws of Islam, where attendance at a mosque is obligatory on men, whereas for women there is an option. If they wish to pray at home, then they're also allowed to do that without sinning.
And so when you're preaching, the same message goes? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, the same message would go. Some mosques would have a video facility where there is a large screen in the women's section and they can see the imam and hear him speaking. Some mosques are designed with a balcony where the women are upstairs on a balcony. And in places like this, we have what we call the mosque receiver system. We have transmitters within the mosque, some devices which relay everything that is said in the mosque into people's homes. So you have home receivers and you can tune in and select whichever mosque you want to listen to. So the women have a wide range of imams to listen to. So if my wife's listening to my sermon, I hear this guy every day, she can switch to a different channel and listen to somebody else.
That's fascinating. Yeah. And they do that, do they?
They do that. They have a wide choice, and it could also be about the subject. Somebody might just be bored to death constantly being told about we have to pray and we have to fast. They want something more relevant to their life.
When you're preaching, how much do you use humour and jokes in what you say?
Quite a bit. It depends on the occasion and the type of audience. And it's not just humour, but also sometimes if I've got a younger audience, I do tend to use quite a bit of sport, particularly football. So any mention of Rooney or Manchester United or
Leicester City.
or even Leicester City, yes, does kind of light up young people's faces, and you've already got a way into their minds, you've got a path into their hearts, and they say, wow, this Imam's cool, he knows about football.
When you're talking in your sermons, talking about texts, how do you speak? I mean, do you speak in the language of the street, or is there a different way of speaking when you're inside the mosque?
I try to avoid street language, just to try and keep it formal, and as we speak, we're interrupted because the prayer is about to begin, so please feel free to observe, and perhaps I'll join the Imam and say my prayer and join you in about 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're inside the mosque now with the Imam giving instructions at the front in an archway cut into the wall. Everyone kneeling, facing the same direction, and then lowering their heads to the ground and then coming back up again. Almost everyone with their heads covered. There's a mixture of men in jeans and people in more traditional clothing, robes.
سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر.
The Imam is facing in the same direction as the congregation, so they can't see his face or his mouth moving. Not getting instructions in that sense.
الله أكبر.
And there are some quite small children, quite small boys at the back
سمع
row,
الله لمن حمده
going through the actions very enthusiastically.
الله أكبر.
You've talked about preaching in English. How big an issue is it, the language that imams use?
I think English is critical. If we are going to reach our current generations and future generations, we have to switch to the English language. That is the language that people understand. I remember a time when I graduated, this was in 1990, hardly any English was being used, and I quickly realized that English was the medium that was needed. And I actually was told off for using English by a very senior imam. But I knew what was happening on the ground, so I persevered.
But many imams still can't speak English, aren't they?
Many imams can't speak English. That is because they never had the opportunity to learn English, or they haven't bothered, and that is sad. To my mind, it's unacceptable that if you've lived in this country for so long and not learned the language and be able to preach in it.
There was a survey I read earlier this year, I think, which was talking about crime levels and the fact that imams who don't speak English just don't reach out to that generation of people, and they're turned away from the mosque and towards other things.
There are other factors that contribute to socialism.
As we're talking, we can hear more language behind us. What's going on here?
The Imam is doing readings in the Urdu language from the traditions of Muhammad, peace be upon him.
So it's wrong, you're saying, to equate the things that people worry about with radical Islam with simply language and not speaking English.
Absolutely.
Because that connection is made, isn't it?
That connection is made, and it is a very wrong connection. It's not the language we should be focusing on first, because you could have someone speaking perfectly good English, yet they're all messed up there, and they've got twisted ideologies and twisted ideas. They could cause havoc,
yes,
as we have seen. And you could have a person who speaks no word of English, but their wisdom and their spirituality and their godliness is transferred through a foreign language. It's what's in the head, it's the attitude, it's the thinking, and the desire for peace or for violence.
I was struck by the image of women at home flicking a dial to choose between different preachers. Language is a live debate then among British Muslims. I spoke to two worshippers as they walked out of the house mosque in a row of terraced Leicester houses.
I consider English as my mother tongue, and when I hear, I understand what the person is saying. If I understand what the preacher is saying, I will enjoy in practicing what he's exactly saying. If he speaks another language, I will just sit there and I will not take you the message which you're trying to bring forward.
What about you, sir? If you don't mind me saying, a slightly older gentleman, do you like to have your preaching in English or not?
I think language basically is a medium of conveying the messages. As long as the people who are actually receiving that message understands, I think that should be the language. Simple as that. But if you talk about the religious language, perhaps people of my generation would probably prefer actually the original Arabic and the Urdu. The reason being, perhaps there is a richness of the language, the sweetness of the language, and then I think perhaps we can very easily relate with some of the terminologies that is being used. While obviously for the younger generation, children who are born and brought up and educated here, perhaps would have difficulties actually relating with some of the concepts that the Eastern languages would actually brought in.
Some may find parallels here with people in Christian churches who feel an attachment to the language of the King James Bible or the Latin Mass. From Leicester, let's head to London to meet Simon Butler, the vicar of St Mary's Battersea in southwest London.
We've come into the church and obviously one of the things that stands out here is our extraordinary pulpit, which is a remarkable wooden structure that must be about 20 feet up.
That is the highest pulpit I've seen.
It's remarkable.
So climb up,
yes,
if you will. And does it increase the sense of performance being up there?
I think there's a bit of a performer in me anyway, so it probably only just underlines that element of my own personality. I think that's true about preachers, actually. I think if there's a vice in preachers, it's that we are, to an extent, actors.
I think you better go. It's very difficult to talk to you up there. I think you better come down. In fact, perhaps just for the experience, I could have a little go from up there. Would that be okay, Simon?
Yes, quite all right.
Are you sure?
Yes.
You can tell me how I sound as a preacher. Goodness me.
Wait, once you're up here, are you aware of the way you speak changing?
I think, given that we preach most of the time from down here because we want to be that much closer, I think there is a formality of the pulpit here that does affect the way you speak. I tend to be a little bit more measured in the pace at which I speak. And I think the tendency to be aware of the opportunities of being a little bit more rhetorical from up there as well. That perhaps I wouldn't be down here.
I'm going to come down now. Any more dizzy? A vicar with vertigo would struggle in St Mary's Battersea. In the pulpit, you're pretty much on a level with the congregation in the upper gallery, handy for spotting a child surreptitiously tapping away at a computer game, as Simon pointed out. Safely back to earth, in fact in the church basement, I asked him about his preaching background.
I went to a theological college that's broadly within the evangelical tradition of the Church of England, so preaching was very important in that tradition. We would go out on sermon class. So one of us would be the preacher for the Sunday, and you'd go out with a group of fellow students and a tutor, and one would preach the sermon, and after the sermon you'd sit down with your peers and with members of the congregation and the local vicar, and you'd talk about what was good and what could have been better and what people took away from it. But the majority of the learning to preach, I think, happens once you're ordained and you're actually in a real parish with a congregation that you're getting to know. There's that sense of being able to focus your preaching on the needs and culture and issues that are around you in that place where you're serving.
So although in language terms it's very much a one-way process, it's all coming from you to your congregation, in another sense it's much more like a conversation, in the sense that you're talking to people with whom you have a relationship, and your language is to some extent guided by that relationship.
I think so. I mean, preaching isn't just about the words that are spoken from the pulpit. They're actually about the words that are heard as well.
When you were at the college you were at, did you get much rhetorical training? Did you get any instruction on how to speak in a way which kept the audience engaged?
I don't recall rhetoric being a particular emphasis. When people start preaching, and I've trained colleagues, very often they will come with some background in some form of public speaking. Very often perhaps they've been a teacher or something like that. And they often immediately start by preaching as though they were giving an after-dinner speech or giving a lesson. And you've got to help people to realise that that's not really the same sort of thing as preaching. And so those rhetorical skills, which are useful in any form of public communication, aren't the only things that you need to be aware of. In fact, you have to be aware of them, because rhetoric can be used in all sorts of ways. I mean, Hitler was a great rhetorician, but his aim was evil and his use of rhetoric was manipulative. So there's got to be an integrity about the person who's preaching and the message that is being preached. Otherwise you end up with an empty shell.
That image that is reinforced by comedy sketches by people like Rowan Atkinson of that very kind of orotund Church of England, old-fashioned, dearly beloved way of speaking. Yes. Is that just the stuff of comedy programmes these days?
On the whole, I think it is. I think you always have to beware of the parsonical voice. There's always the danger that that voice is there in some people's way of speaking, and that they slowly get into the habit of preaching in that slightly orotund way, and you just have to stamp on it and say, this is no good. You've got a voice that is yours, and that's the voice you've been given to use.
And I suppose there is some people might think that at a time when church attendances, certainly looking back over a period of centuries, church attendances are nothing like what they once were, that you're almost in the kind of business of advertising, and that your sermon needs to be as exciting as possible, and your language needs to be as fun and interesting as possible, and your delivery as interesting as possible, to try and get people, it's a getting people through the door exercise.
I think we now preach in an age which is broadly post-Christian, that the assumptions of what we might call Christendom, where everybody who was British was a Christian, have now long gone, and that we don't assume that. And that means that the level of religious knowledge and the level of biblical literacy has changed vastly. And that means that we have to find new ways of speaking and the language that is necessary to do that in order to communicate effectively to this generation. But on the other hand, there's something about preaching that doesn't require all those potential gimmicks, but is simply, and this is a great quote that has been important for me as I think about preaching. One of the great preachers of our day is an Old Testament scholar called Walter Brueggemann from the southern states. And he talks about preaching as speaking poetry in a prose-flattened world, by which he means that there's something of the artist about the preacher, that there's something about a world that has become flattened and deadened through the endless, constant stream of language that we now live with. Language that can be technical, political, language that simply doesn't make the soul live.
It's had the life taken out of it.
And that the job of the poet, and therefore the job of the preacher, is to speak to a different part of the human condition, which is the imagination. And it's in the place where people imagine a different way of being that they find power in themselves, and power from God, I'd want to say, to actually change. And of course the Christian language of conversion is very much what preaching is about.
Simon talks about dwindling levels of biblical literacy, and a recent study by the Church in Wales suggests younger generations now regard Christianity as a foreign language, and what goes on in churches as strange, even alien. If so, then there's even more pressure on the men and women in the pulpit to bridge a language divide. The Times newspaper used to run a Preacher of the Year competition, and I spoke to the paper's religious correspondent, Ruth Gledhill.
From my experience, from hearing from when I was very young, lots and lots of different preachers, and being very privileged now to hear some of the world's best preachers just through the course of doing my job, I would say that preaching has got immeasurably better. It's still got a little way to go. Preachers still need to learn to change and adapt. One thing I would say is that they've wisely eschewed some of the modern multimedia ways of presenting sermons. I think the best sermons are those still delivered, not really maybe using notes but not reading a script, still delivered from the pulpit by a preacher without a microphone if possible, maybe with a microphone, where you get the human being talking directly to his congregation about things of the Spirit.
Are the most prominent bishops and archbishops partly there because of their preaching skills, do you think?
What I find fascinating about the present leadership of the Church of England, for whatever its faults in other areas, all the top bishops and archbishops now are fantastic preachers. I never forget the first time I heard Rowan Williams preach, and it was such a moving sermon and it was so powerful, and it really had me rooted to the spot, completely lost in the word, completely lost in what he was saying.
The one great purpose of the Church's existence is to share that bread of life, to hold open in its words and actions a place where we can be with Jesus, and to be channels for his free, unanxious, utterly demanding, grown-up love.
How much is delivery part of this? How much does delivery matter?
That's very important indeed, especially in today's age when people have such high standards and high expectations of what people should be like when they're speaking publicly. People are coming out of school now having been very, very well trained in media presentation and the art of public speaking. So preachers now have to be better than that, whereas there was a time when very few people had access to those skills, and so a much lower standard of preaching was acceptable.
Here's Max Atkinson, the author of a book called Lend Me Your Ears, which looks at speech-making and rhetoric.
All the evidence is that wherever people are engaged in public speaking, whether it's politics, religion or whatever it is, the same rhetorical techniques will work with similar impact. So in a sense, there's no difference at all.
Do you think people sometimes, if they're asked whether they use rhetorical techniques, are inclined to say no because they don't want to admit to it?
Absolutely. There's something called rhetorical denial that I've investigated, because you find a lot of really good speakers deny that they use rhetoric at all. And I think one of the problems is that rhetoric has become a term of abuse in modern society, rather than a word to refer to a series of techniques that work to speak persuasively.
And when it comes to preaching, what kind of rhetorical techniques do you think we might find in modern churches, mosques, synagogues?
There's no doubt that a good preacher is somebody who is capable of using the standard rhetorical techniques, not just rhetorical techniques. So, for example, they will use a 3-part list, a sermon with 3 points in it. They're also big on storytelling, because storytelling, the use of imagery, is very much a key part of the whole rhetorical armoury.
And with some preaching, you might find a preacher kind of reaching out to the audience, appealing to them.
Very much so. And I mean, you could say that the rhetorical question is a standard technique anyway. And if you can get people actually to respond to a question, you can get something going a bit more like a conversation, where you have turn-taking. Why do people pay attention in conversation? Answer the ever-present threat they might have to speak. So they have to listen. And so if a preacher can get an audience to respond to what they're saying, they can get a conversation going with the audience. If you listen to some of the great speeches by Martin Luther King, you find that his style was very much in the Southern Baptist tradition, preacher tradition, and the audience were literally joining in. So he would be saying something and they would say, "Yeah, man," before he would proceed. And that applies to I Have a Dream speech, for example. The audience is very responsive in a way that is quite unusual, for example, in a British political speech.
I'm outside a church now in the Stokes Croft area of Bristol. It doesn't have a stone front, it's made of corrugated metal, a huge yellow corrugated metal sheet, and it was once a nightclub. There's a huge sign up there which says the Redeemed Christian Church of God, which is a worldwide movement described by one of its founders as made in heaven, assembled in Nigeria, exported to the world.
In the mighty name of Jesus, circumcise our heart, to you be the glory, Lord. Thank you, Father. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. You say, Father, every good thing that sin has killed in my life, by your mercy, restore it today. Pray, 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 pray. Every good thing that sin has killed in my life, Father, by your mercy, restore it today in the name of Jesus.
What did you think of the message?
It was perfect, excellent. We have problems in our lives, and when you come to church, you feel like they are gone.
What did you think of the message?
The message is a very inspirational message. It gives everybody a kind of clean heart.
And what kind of preacher is he? How do you find his style?
Yeah, this kind of emotional. That you audience, you always think that he's talking to you. You know, as if he knows what you're doing. You know what I mean? I always feel like, wow, God is speaking to me.
Don't be too quick to make promise. Think very well before you speak. Because after you are spoken, people are waiting whether you'll be able to read or not. And if you don't have the ability to redeem it, the devil will begin to minister. Don't spoil your name, you have to do something. That do something means you're going to commit sin. You break the law. I'm trusting God. Every demonic manipulation, fashion against your life.
And what do you think of the pastor? What do you think of the way he delivers the message?
Yeah, I've been here for a few years now, and he's been a wonderful person. He's been sincere. He's been plain. He's a really nice person.
And you like the experience? We've got a big screen up on the wall here, and the message "Sin No More" was scrolling across in a red banner.
Yeah. It's like, oh, I'm really sinning, and I think I need to stop.
So you've got the pastor saying it again and again, "Sin no more." He's a very loud, passionate preacher, isn't he?
Yeah, it's filled with, as in his voice is very powerful. So since I've been coming here, my life has been so different, you know.
So the message that changes your life, does it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, because I could remember the first time I came to this country, you know. I look at where I was before and I look at myself now. You know, there's a lot of massive improvement in me and my family.
I'm Pastor Kasali Fatai, so I'm the pastor of the church.
Right, in the Redeemed Christian Church
of God.
And it's a church that originated in Nigeria, is that?
Originally, the church started from Nigeria, but today we have got parishes over 100 countries in the world.
And your speaking style, is that typical of the Redeemed Christian Church of God, the way you talk?
It depends on the individual.
So why do you speak in the way that you do?
It depends on the audience. You devise a way of doing your things, packaging your message so that those you want to get across to, you can get across to them.
And you have a young Nigerian audience here, a young family audience. We can hear the children behind us, so you're speaking to that generation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And your language, I think I heard you use the word bloody a couple of times. You talked about bloody sin and bloody drunkards once. Is this a colourful language as part of your way of speaking?
Yeah. Just to emphasize the seriousness of the matter. When I say the bloody sin or whatever, just trying to create an awareness how terrible it could be.
And you use humour a lot, don't you? I mean,
yeah.
You can hear people giggling in the.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think we're trying to make it as lively as possible.
Yeah.
We mix it together. People must enjoy it, but they must also realize that it's a serious matter we are talking about.
And that edition of Word of Mouth was presented by Chris Ledyard. You can listen to this and other editions by going to the programme's pages on the Radio 4 website. Word of Mouth is based on an original idea by Frank Delaney, and it was produced in Bristol by Beth O'D. In a moment, Tartan Tat and Highland Kitsch. Why has Sir Walter Scott been accused of tarnishing the image of Scotland when he invented the idea of Scottishness? Great Lives will put him back on the pedestal after we've heard from Eddie Mair.
The cost of travelling by train will rise by an average of more than 6% for millions of passengers next year. Quite how much more you'll pay depends on where you are in the United Kingdom. In PM at 5 o'clock we'll have the details and ask whether disgruntled railway passengers could learn a thing or two from the car lobby. As we prepare for the Paralympics, the death of a politician who was the first minister